She boarded as a quiet passenger, a silhouette in the bustling cabin. Yet when the powerful engines sputtered and died mid-flight, it was her, and only her, who possessed the rare knowledge to coax life back into them. The journey began with an unassuming calm. Flight 227, bound from Dallas to Colorado Springs, lifted off precisely on schedule. The sky was a vast, unblemished blue, and the initial ascent was remarkably smooth. There was no hint of turbulence, no whisper of impending trouble. Just the familiar, droning announcements from the cockpit, the gentle rattle of a beverage cart dispensing lukewarm drinks, and the quiet tableau of passengers lost in the glow of their phones or idly turning pages of magazines. They had no real desire to read. Ayana Fielding occupied seat 14C, directly above the wing, lodged in the middle. She wasn't particularly fond of it, but she wasn't one to make a fuss. An overbooking had bumped her from an earlier flight, and this was simply the next available option. She accepted it with the same quiet composure she had cultivated over the years, a serene resignation that had become her second nature. Her attire was unassuming. Dark jeans, practical sneakers, and a soft green pullover. Her hair, drawn back into a neat no-nonsense bun, drew no attention. In fact, nothing about her did, and that suited her perfectly. To her left, a man perpetually adjusted his seat, muttering under his breath about insufficient leg room. The teenager on her right, earbuds firmly in place, was engrossed in something on his phone, punctuated by sporadic chuckles. Neither of them seemed to register her presence. Most people didn't. That was perfectly fine. Ayana wasn't flying for work. There was no conference to speak at, no class to teach, no board of directors awaiting her expertise. She was simply traveling to Pueblo to visit her mother. Her mother's voice had sounded weaker than usual during their call last week. "Come soon if you can," she'd urged. So Ayana had booked the flight and packed minimally, a backpack and a purse, both neatly stowed beneath the seat in front of her. She retrieved a crossword puzzle book and a pen from her bag, settling into the familiar rhythm of clues and answers. A quiet mint dissolving on her tongue as the aircraft's engines hummed a steady tune. Row 14, positioned just behind the wing, afforded her a unique vantage point. She could distinctly hear the mechanical shifts of the flaps. Most people wouldn't catch the subtle change in pitch when the engines adjusted for altitude, but Ayana could. She always had. That particular sensitivity was a remnant of her years in the Air Force. Most passengers on this flight had no inkling that she had once been a flight systems engineer, meticulously running diagnostics on aircraft so intricate they demanded 3 separate manuals just for pre-flight checks. Now she taught at a small university in Amarillo. Nothing glamorous, just guiding engineering students through the complexities of thermodynamics and their demanding senior projects. She rarely volunteered information about her past unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't about concealment. It was simply a lesson she'd learned long ago. People perceived you differently once they discovered you used to repair jets, or that you had logged countless hours inside a flight simulator more advanced than what most regional pilots ever encountered. But all of that felt distant now. On this flight, she wasn't Dr. Fielding. She was merely another passenger, journeying from one place to another. She glanced out the window. The sun had begun its gentle descent. Golden hour. The wing gleamed against the deepening orange of the sky. Somewhere far below, vast fields stretched across New Mexico, flat and open, offering an endless expanse to the horizon. The plane then encountered a minor jolt, a subtle dip in its trajectory. Nothing overtly serious, and Ayana barely reacted, yet she registered the distinct flicker in the overhead lights. Her gaze lifted. One flicker, then a second, and then everything seemed to stabilize. Most passengers remained oblivious, perhaps dismissing it as a fleeting moment of turbulence or a minor hiccup. It was easily missed, but Ayana's eyes remained fixed on the cabin ceiling. Something about the timing felt off. The lights flickered again, this time more pronounced. The engine pitch wavered, a subtle discord she felt in her chest before she even consciously registered the sound. Then came a sharper jolt. What followed, however, would instantly silence every voice on that aircraft. The plane dropped, fast. This was no gentle descent, no mere turbulence. This was different, a sudden, violent yank by an unseen force, as if gravity itself had seized the aircraft by its nose. A collective gasp surged through the cabin. Trays clattered, drinks sloshed, spilling over seats and laps. A few piercing screams tore through the sudden hush. Ayana gripped the armrest, her body, instinctively pressing back against the seat as her mind frantically tried to reconcile the sensation with the mechanical possibilities. This was not normal, not at this altitude, not this kind of precipitous drop. Then, darkness. For 2 agonizing seconds, everything went black. The cabin lights, the entertainment screens, the comforting whir of the fans, all gone. Then, the emergency lights activated, flickering weakly along the aisle in a dull, ominous red-orange, like a dying backup generator struggling for life. Ayana leaned forward, pressing her hand against the seat in front of her. The teenager beside her ripped out his earbuds and shot bolt upright. The man to her left cursed under his breath, clutching the armrest with both hands. Then, the masks dropped. In every single row, a cold, echoing clatter as the yellow cup swung down in eerie unison, bouncing slightly from the lingering lurch. Some passengers shrieked. Others fumbled frantically, struggling to recall the emergency instructions. A woman across the aisle was already sobbing, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't manage to pull the elastic band over her head. Ayana, in contrast, reached for her mask and slipped it on with practiced ease. Her gaze swept upwards. The lights above were no longer flickering. They were dead. The steady engine hum was gone, replaced by a strange, unsettling, whirring sound she knew all too well. It was the sound of an aircraft gliding. Not flying, gliding. That meant the engines were off. No thrust, no lift control, no hydraulic assistance. Her mind raced. In an aircraft like this, likely a twin-engine regional jet, such a condition indicated a catastrophic failure. Possibly electrical, possibly far worse. A flight attendant, tall and visibly jittery, stumbled into the aisle and attempted to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, remain calm. Please pull down on your oxygen masks and breathe normally." Her voice cracked midway through the sentence, her hands visibly trembling. Ayana watched her intently, not from panic, but for what she would say next. "There has been a systems error. The captain and first officer are assessing." The flight attendant's radio crackled. She turned, her face pale, towards the cockpit, desperately trying to relay a message. Ayana strained, her senses heightened. The radio crackled again, then erupted into what sounded like muffled shouting. Not panic, but intense stress, words she could barely decipher, but enough. "Rudder not responding. Controls dead. Hydraulics. Check hydraulic line 3. Ayana's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just bad. This was critical. Not merely a failure, but a full system shutdown. And now they were talking about lost rudder control? That meant the flight surfaces were unresponsive. They weren't just losing altitude. They were effectively flying blind. She reached beneath the seat, retrieved her backpack, and unzipped the front pocket. From it, she pulled out a pen and a small notepad. Her fingers began to jot down everything she'd overheard. She had done this before, not on a commercial jet, but in war zones, in arid desert hangars where aircraft lifted off, with no guarantee of how they would return. The man beside her peered over, a confused frown on his face. What are you doing? Listening, she replied simply. To what? He blinked at her. To the things they're not saying out loud. She offered nothing further. There was no time. Her eyes scanned the overhead panel, then returned to the flight attendant, who was receiving another garbled message. The attendant turned back towards the cabin, attempting to maintain composure, but her face betrayed the stark truth. She was utterly lost, unsure of what to do next. Ayana glanced down the aisle. Passengers were spiraling into a collective panic. One woman was openly praying, her voice rising in fervent pleas. A man further back was on his phone, audibly leaving what sounded like a final goodbye message. A child somewhere near the rear of the plane screamed for her mother. The entire aircraft was in an emotional free fall, and they hadn't even touched the ground. But Ayana wasn't watching them anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the cockpit door. It remained resolutely closed. In a failure of this magnitude, with this level of escalating risk, the pilots should have made a cabin announcement by now. At the very least, a word of reassurance. But there had been nothing but radio silence, which meant either they were completely engrossed in damage control, or they were dangerously in over their heads. Someone, however, needed to speak up before the entire plane surrendered to despair. Ayana unbuckled her seatbelt. The seatbelt sign, of course, remained illuminated, but it no longer mattered. The plane wasn't bouncing. It was sinking steadily like something incredibly heavy that had simply given up the fight to stay airborne. Passengers gasped as she stood up. "Ma'am, please sit down," the flight attendant called out, already rushing towards her, her voice laced with urgency. "I need to speak to the captain," Ayana stated, her voice firm yet remarkably calm. We're handling it," the attendant stammered. "You're not," Ayana interrupted, her tone sharp but devoid of aggression. "If the rudder's unresponsive and the backup hydraulics aren't kicking in, they're losing surface control. If they're still gliding at this altitude, they've got about 10 minutes, maybe less, before they have to ditch or land somewhere. They won't have time to troubleshoot both." The attendant froze, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. Ayana looked her directly in the eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with a crystal-clear resolve. "I'm a former Air Force flight systems engineer. I used to teach emergency protocols for this exact type of multi-system failure. I know what's happening. I can help." The flight attendant stared for a moment, visibly torn between strict airline protocol and the stark, immediate necessity. Then, with a single decisive nod, she pivoted and moved towards the cockpit. The man in 14A leaned back, his eyes wide. "Wait, are you serious?" Ayana didn't answer him. Her gaze remained fixed on the attendant. The cockpit door cracked open after a tense 30 seconds, already too long. The attendant spoke to the captain, her voice low but rapid. The door opened wider. The pilot stepped out halfway, his eyes scanning the aisle as if he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. "Which one is she?" he asked. The attendant pointed. Ayana stepped forward. The pilot was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with tired eyes and beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "You said you worked flight systems?" 15 years, for GE? Ayana stated. "I've written training protocols for cascade failures like this." He blinked. "What are you doing in coach?" Ayana offered a tight, brief smile. "Just trying to get home." He looked back towards the cockpit, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the situation was even more dire than she had anticipated. The co-pilot had his headset half off, his fingers fumbling desperately with switches that were clearly unresponsive. One of the primary screens had gone entirely black. Another was displaying erratic, meaningless data. Altitude readings were jumping wildly, and none of the manual control feedback was registering. "Full power loss?" Ayana asked, assessing the chaos. "Yeah. It started about 12 minutes ago. We lost redundancy across the hydraulic lines. Some kind of electrical surge tripped half the board." "APU?" she inquired, referring to the auxiliary power unit. "Offline. Won't reset." Ayana leaned over, scrutinizing the side panel. "Did you check the secondary bus switch for bleed air override?" The co-pilot looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. We didn't. We were trying to restart through the backup generator, but the power loop's not responding." She nodded grimly. "That's why your rudder's gone. If the pressure valves are stuck open, you're bleeding off everything through line 3, and nothing's getting to the tail." She moved closer to the panel, careful not to touch anything without explicit permission. "May I?" The captain hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Ayana reached down and toggled 2 switches, then flicked a third one, then paused. Her concentration absolute. "Try your rudder pedals now. Just a little pressure." The captain complied, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "It's responding, barely." "It'll hold long enough to get you level," Ayana confirmed, her voice steady. "But you need to pick a landing site now. You're gliding, and you've got about 80 meters left in this airframe before gravity finishes the job." The co-pilot immediately began rechecking the altimeter data. "There's an old strip near Socorro, emergency use only, but it's listed." Ayana nodded. "That'll work. You'll need to do a long, wide loop to approach from the west. Keep the turn shallow. You don't have the yaw for anything sharp." The captain exhaled heavily, a profound relief washing over his strained features. You just saved this plane." Ayana didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside the cockpit, the passengers were still scared, still confused, still clinging to armrests and prayer. They had no idea that the quiet woman in seat 14C had just corrected a flight path the pilots themselves didn't even know how to fix. But saving the plane was merely the beginning. The true test lay in bringing it safely back to Earth. Ayana remained in the cockpit, standing just behind the captain and co-pilot. The door was now securely locked again, as per protocol. The air within the small space felt warmer, stale, and thick with tension. "Socorro airstrip is 70 miles out," the co-pilot reported, his voice tight. "We're at 28,000 feet and falling steady. If we can hold glide speed—" "We won't," Ayana gently interjected. You've lost both thrust and hydraulic boost. You'll bleed speed trying to angle in. You've got maybe 60 miles. Less if that crosswind picks up. The pilot glanced at her. You're thinking we dump weight? Too late for that, she replied. You can't get the landing gear doors open manually without bleed pressure, and gravity drop might only unlock one side. If one wheel's loose and the other isn't, you'll spin out. So, belly landing? He asked, his voice low with a grim understanding. She nodded once. You won't have a better option. The pilot leaned back, visibly processing the stark reality. The co-pilot turned to her, his brow furrowed. Why do you know all this? Ayana offered a brief, almost imperceptible smile. Because I used to run failure simulations just like this. Only we didn't have 147 people sitting behind us when we made a mistake. The captain looked down at the unresponsive controls. What would you do if you were in my seat? I'd stay off the radios, she advised. You don't need the FAA trying to walk you through something they've only read about in a training binder. Focus on the glide path. Start a slow descent now. No sudden drops. The co-pilot began adjusting trim settings, his movements precise. We're going to have to go in blind on elevation. That old airstrip doesn't have approach lighting. Ayana grabbed a small flashlight from the side panel and aimed its beam at the printed terrain map. You've got hills on the west and a flat field just beyond the strip. Aim long. If you overshoot, you're still alive. The captain stared at the map for a long moment. Then he turned towards the cockpit phone and lifted the receiver. This is the captain speaking. I need your attention. His voice, though strained, cracked through the plane's PA system. Behind the door, they could hear a sudden murmuring and shuffling as passengers froze to listen. We've experienced a system-wide power failure. We are currently gliding toward a backup airstrip in New Mexico. The situation is under control. Please stay seated and keep your oxygen masks on. I need everyone to remain calm. We will get through this together. He hung up and looked at Ayana, a raw honesty in his eyes. I meant that. I'm not trying to sound like a hero, but having you here, I'm not sure we'd still be in the air if you hadn't stood up. Ayana nodded, slowly, her voice quieter now, tinged with a quiet resolve. You've still got one job left. Land this thing. Then you can thank me. They fell silent for a few moments, the only sound the faint, eerie whir of the gliding aircraft. Then a soft knock came at the cockpit door. The flight attendant's voice followed. She's asking for Dr. Fielding. The captain looked confused. I thought you were staying in here. I need 10 seconds with someone, Ayana said. I'll be right back. He buzzed the lock open. She stepped back into the cabin. The attendant led her halfway down the aisle to a panicked woman who was gripping her seat tray with white knuckles. Her daughter sat beside her, crying softly into a stuffed animal. I didn't know who else to ask, the mother whispered, her voice trembling. They said you knew what was going on. Are we going to die? Ayana knelt beside her. No, she said softly, her voice unwavering. We're not. The woman began to cry harder, though quietly now. Ayana reached across the aisle and gently took both her hands. We're landing in less than 15 minutes. It's not going to be pretty, but it's going to be over fast. And you're going to walk off that plane with your daughter. You understand me? The woman nodded, her eyes wide. Ayana stood and addressed the entire row, her voice carrying an unexpected authority. Breathe slow. Stay low in your seat. The front of the plane will take the worst of it. You'll feel a hard hit when we touch down, and we might skid, but that's part of the plan. Someone 2 rows back asked, "Who are you?" Ayana didn't answer that. She simply said, "Put your mask back on and keep it tight." Then she turned and walked calmly back to the cockpit. But as they began their descent, even Ayana didn't know if her carefully laid plan would actually hold. The descent began. Shallow, smooth, controlled. For now. The mountains near Socorro grew larger in the cockpit windows. At first, they looked harmless, just another part of the sprawling landscape. But as the plane sank lower and the horizon tilted ever so slightly, those same peaks started to feel much closer than they had any right to be. "Airspeed's dropping faster than we thought," the co-pilot muttered, tapping on a screen that remained unresponsive. "I'm getting unreliable data." Ayana leaned over. "You're gliding without thrust or gear. You're flying dead weight with people in it. Forget the screen. Feel the stick." The captain adjusted slowly, his hands firm but deliberate, his knuckles white with strain. Ayana tapped the terrain map again. "Remember, come in from the west. You've got a strip of flat land on the far side. If you drop too soon, you'll clip that ridge. If you wait too long, you'll overshoot the runway." The co-pilot nodded, but a deep worry etched his face. "We overshoot, we die. If we undershoot, we die slower." Ayana didn't blink. "Then don't miss." Out in the cabin, the mood had shifted from raw panic to a frozen, terrified silence. Everyone knew they were critically low. You didn't need to be a pilot to feel the pressure building in your ears or to see the dirt roads and water tanks growing alarmingly closer through the windows. A little girl somewhere up front was whispering the same phrase over and over, a soft, repetitive sound. No one hushed her. It was something like a prayer. Maybe it was one. Back in the cockpit, Ayana saw something that made her stomach clench. A red light flashing insistently beneath the secondary panel. "Fuel vapor pressure," she said aloud, her voice taut. "You've got fumes building in the left wing. That's from the residual suction near the shut-off valves. If that leaks during landing, it could ignite." The captain cursed under his breath. Ayana pointed. "You need to keep the left. Wing up on touchdown, tilt slightly. Come in on the right." "But we'll tip," the captain interjected, his voice tight. "I know." He paused, then asked, "How sure are you?" She met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I'm not, but I've read 6 crash reports where they didn't try." Every one of them ended the same way. The plane dipped slightly, then miraculously straightened. The co-pilot reached for the landing gear control. "We're coming in." Ayana held her breath. He pulled the lever. Nothing. "Manual release," he urged. "Already tried." Ayana shook her head. "Don't force it. We go belly down." The ground was rushing up now, fast. "Throttle dead. Flaps. No response." Ayana looked out the front window and pointed. "There. That stretch, just beyond. The marker poles. Aim there." The captain locked his focus. The plane slid forward, an enormous bird with broken wings. It wasn't flying. It was falling with a terrifying grace. And then impact. The front of the fuselage hit hard, dragging against dirt, gravel, and uneven patches of land. Sparks flew wildly from beneath them. Ayana felt the plane twist slightly to the left. The right side dug in. The tail began to spin uncontrollably. Inside, passengers screamed, a cacophony of terror. Seatbelts strained against desperate bodies. A few oxygen masks snapped off their hooks, swinging uselessly. Something heavy in the rear cabin broke loose and slammed into the aisle wall. Ayana instinctively braced herself against the side wall, preparing for the worst. The captain fought the yoke, his face a mask of fierce concentration. The nose bucked once. The tail swung again. And then, silence. They were still. Dust filled the cockpit, thick and choking. Nobody moved for a moment, suspended in the aftermath. Then the co-pilot, his voice shaking, whispered, "Did we? Are we?" Ayana pressed a hand to her chest. Her heart was pounding, a furious drumbeat against her ribs. She turned and opened the cockpit door. The cabin behind her was pure chaos. Oxygen masks dangling, people sobbing openly, others sitting in complete stunned shock. But they were alive. Every single one of them. She stepped out and raised her voice, clear and commanding despite the tremor in her own body. "We're down. You're okay, but we need to evacuate. Stay calm. Follow crew instructions." A few people began to clap weakly. Others simply stared, tears streaming down their faces. A little boy near the back threw up into a paper bag. Ayana turned back to the cockpit. "We need to start the emergency release hatches." "I can help." The pilot stared at her as if he couldn't quite believe she was still standing. "You just landed this plane," he whispered, a profound awe in his voice. "No," Ayana corrected him. "You did. I just reminded you how." But walking away from this wreckage was going to leave a mark deeper than any scar. Smoke hissed from the left wing. Ayana was the first to step off the plane, moving with purpose. She guided people out through the emergency hatch near the back, gently helping the elderly, cradling a crying child and placing him safely into his mother's trembling arms. Her shoes crunched against rocks and dirt as the cabin slowly emptied behind her. The ground was rough, uneven, half covered in dry grass and sand. This was no airstrip. It was barely a landing zone, but it had been enough. Fire crews weren't there. There was no tower, just the hollow echo of the wind and the acrid smell of overheated metal. Somewhere nearby, a siren began to wail, faint at first, perhaps from a county fire unit that had finally been pinged by the aircraft's emergency transponder. Ayana took a few steps back, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking now, though they hadn't been before. Not in the cockpit. Not during the impact. Now they trembled. That's when the captain emerged. His uniform shirt was stained with sweat, his left sleeve torn near the elbow. But his gaze was fixed intently on her. "You didn't just help us," he said, his voice raw. "You gave us a shot when we didn't know what to do." Ayana didn't say anything. She didn't want applause. She didn't want a medal. She hadn't done this for praise. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you hadn't stood up, if you'd stayed quiet, we'd be dead." She looked over at the passengers, now gathering in small clumps, hugging each other, sobbing into phones. One woman sat cross-legged in the dirt, holding her child so tightly it seemed she was afraid to let go. "I wasn't supposed to be on this flight," Ayana murmured, almost to herself. "They bumped me off the earlier one." The captain smiled faintly, a tired but genuine expression. "I think someone bumped you here for a reason." Ayana looked up as the first fire truck bounced its way towards them over the dirt road, kicking up a plume of dust. Behind it came an ambulance and a dusty sheriff's cruiser. The co-pilot approached, his headset still dangling around his neck. "News crews are already on it. FAA's been alerted. They're going to want a full report." Let them write whatever they want, Ayana said, a hint of weariness in her voice. Just make sure they spell my name right if they insist on putting me in the papers. He chuckled softly. Dr. Ayana Fielding. They'll remember. By the time the buses arrived to transport the shaken passengers to a nearby community center, Ayana had gracefully faded into the background. She didn't pose for any photos, she didn't give a speech. But as she climbed onto the bus, a hand reached out and gripped hers. It was the same mother from the cabin, the one who couldn't get her mask on, her daughter clinging silently to her leg. I didn't know who you were, the woman whispered, tears in her eyes. I didn't know you were the one saving us. Ayana nodded slowly. You didn't need to. You just needed to believe we'd land. The woman looked like she wanted to say more, but Ayana gently squeezed her hand and kept walking. The bus was quiet as it pulled away. People were exhausted, numb. Some were whispering into phones, sharing their harrowing ordeal. Others just stared out the window, watching the wreckage grow smaller in the distance. Ayana sat in the third row. She leaned her head against the cool glass and finally exhaled, a long, slow release of breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 12 hours ago, she was just flying to see her mother. Now, she was the reason 147 people were still breathing. The man who had been sitting beside her in 14A walked down the aisle and stopped at her row. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice humbled. Back when you stood up, I thought you were crazy. She looked at him. I don't blame you. I think I'm going to go back to school, he said suddenly, a newfound conviction in his tone. Learn something real. I'm tired of sitting around pretending I know things, when people like you actually do. She smiled gently. Then it was worth it. The rest of the ride was silent. No one played music, no one laughed, but there was a strange peace in that silence, like everyone had agreed that life just felt different now. And maybe they wouldn't forget this. Not tomorrow. Not ever. But even after they got home, what Ayana had done would ripple into lives far beyond that runway. It made the news, of course it did. Unbelievable heroism on Flight 227. Professor steps in, saves doomed plane. Passenger with military background prevents catastrophe. Every headline offered a different angle. Some got the details right. Most didn't. They showed grainy footage of the wrecked plane surrounded by dirt, emergency crews, and dazed passengers wrapped in silver blankets. Some outlets called it a miracle. Others turned it into a debate about pilot training and system failures. But one thing kept appearing. Her name. Dr. Ayana Fielding. Reporters camped outside the university in Amarillo where she taught. Students started referring to her office as Mission Control. Her email overflowed with messages, some grateful, some curious, some simply strange. She answered none of them. Ayana didn't want to be famous. She didn't even want to be interviewed. She just wanted to get back to her mother, and she did. 2 days later, after renting a car and driving quietly through southern Colorado, Ayana knocked on her mother's door in Pueblo. Her mother opened it slowly, already leaning on her walker, already waiting. "Was that you I saw on the news?" she asked, her voice raspy. Ayana smiled faintly. "Yeah." Her mother shook her head, a gentle reproof. "You always were too smart to sit in silence." They sat at the kitchen table, drank tea, and watched the rain tap softly against the windows. And for the first time in years, Ayana allowed herself to feel what she hadn't let surface on that plane. Fear, not panic. Not the chaos of screaming passengers, but the heavy, slow fear of being responsible for lives you may not save. "I wasn't sure," she whispered. "I wasn't sure we'd make it." Her mother reached out and placed a hand over hers. "Doesn't matter," she said simply. "You stood up anyway." That night, Ayana lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old radiator hum through the walls. No headlines, no buzzing phones, just quiet, the kind that comes after the storm. 3 weeks later, she returned to work. Her students stood when she entered the room. She waved them off. "Sit down," she said, her voice firm. "We've got work to do." One of the students hesitantly raised a hand. "Professor Fielding, is it true you landed a plane?" She didn't smile. She didn't joke. She just nodded. "Yeah, and I'm here to teach you how not to ever be in that situation." They listened differently now, not because she was a hero, but because they saw what experience truly looked like. What quiet strength meant. And maybe that was the real story. Ayana didn't save the plane because she wanted credit. She didn't stand up to prove anything. She did it because she saw something broken and she knew how to fix it. In the months that followed, a few passengers reached out. One sent her a photo of their family at Christmas with a heartfelt note. "We made it because you didn't, wait for permission." A little girl mailed her a drawing. A woman with wings standing at the front of a plane, smiling. Ayana hung it in her office right above her desk, not for anyone else, but as a personal reminder. Because sometimes, the person you ignore, the one you don't thank, don't notice, don't even truly see, that's the one who will save your life. Ayana Fielding didn't look like a pilot. She wasn't wearing a badge. She didn't speak first, but she knew what to do when nobody else did, and she stood up anyway. If this story taught you something, remember this. Sometimes leadership doesn't sound like shouting. Sometimes courage looks like standing up when nobody's asking you to. So when it's your moment, don't wait for permission. Do the right thing.